Hi, friends. Rick Edwards here. Welcome back for another lesson from the Gospel Project. We continue our study of the book of 1 Samuel, and today we're going to be looking at a core passage from 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 3 through 12 and 16 through 20. But as is usually the case, you want to be sure and look at the entire chapter, look at the entire context here, so you get a full understanding of what's happening. So this is the story of David's mercy toward Saul. More than once, David is being chased by King Saul, who wants to kill him. And David has the opportunity to kill Saul and end the problem, to become king. And David consistently refuses not to do so, saying he will not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed or against the Lord's king, because Saul was, in fact, the rightfully appointed and anointed king of Israel. So David says, I'm not going to do it. Even though he was encouraged to kill Saul, he had the opportunity to do so, as we see in this text today, but he chooses not to do so. Now, as always, be sure to look at the lesson, be sure to read the material, read the curriculum, and because my comments are going to be supplemental to what you're studying in the quarterly, okay? Or in the curriculum. Now, I want to say a couple of things at the outset here. One is that this story, this text, is not intended to say that just as David was merciful to Saul, so we are to be merciful to others. Yes, that is a true statement. It is true that we should be merciful to other people, but that's not the point of this story. Neither is it the point of this story that when we show mercy to others, it softens their hearts. That may be a true statement many times. Sometimes, many times perhaps, when we show mercy, that does in fact soften a person's heart. But that's not the point of this story about David's mercy toward Saul. So what is the point? Well, we're going to get to that and hammer on that just a little bit. But what I want to point out here is that actually Saul himself sort of states the purpose of this story. He, from his very own mouth, affirms certain things about David, such as Saul makes the point that David is more righteous than he is. Verse 17, Saul says that himself. David is more righteous than I am. And Saul also says in verse 20 that David is going to be king. So Saul himself recognizes these things, and in this story, the real point of the story is that David is in fact more righteous than Saul, and that David is going to become king. He's not king yet, but he is going to be. So this is the real point of the story for us, for any reader, to understand that in this transitional period from the judges to the monarchy, excuse me, from the judges to the monarchy, Saul has become king, but he's not doing a very good job, and he's not the kind of king that God wants Israel to have. The kind of king God wants Israel to have is the kind of king that David is going to be, a righteous king. So that's really what's happening here, is that the writer is helping us see this ongoing contrast between Saul and David. Even though Saul was chosen by the people and chosen by God to be the first king, he was never really the kind of king that God wanted Israel to have. And so we see this contrast throughout the book of 1 Samuel between Saul and David. So I want to make a very important point here, that the stories of the Bible are not fables. Now, you know what a fable is. A fable is when we tell a little story, like the tortoise and the hare. That's a fable. And then we glean from that story some kind of moral or ethical truth. And we say, see there, you should be diligent. It's more important to be diligent than it is to be really fast, like the hare. The tortoise ultimately wins because he was more diligent. Well, that's great. Fables are great in their place, but the biblical stories are not fables. They're not designed just to be told, a story told, and then say, oh, what can we learn from this story? As though it were a fable. There are things we can learn from these stories, but we must not treat them as fables or perceive that they're merely stories from which we are to draw moral or ethical applications of some kind. Okay? So it's very important for us to understand what's the point. And oftentimes, authors will record stories without any intention of providing a moral or ethical application for us. They simply want us to know what happened. And that's okay. Sometimes that's all we need to know and all we need to understand is that certain things happened. Now, there are always underlying truths taking place throughout all the biblical stories. Things like the fact that God is sovereign, God has a purpose, He's going to accomplish His purposes. These things are always true and they're always there underlying the stories. But we need to understand that sometimes biblical authors provided stories for us simply because they wanted us to know what happened. And that's all there is to it. Now, we can draw applications, as we're going to see today. But it's important to understand that the Bible stories are not fables, okay? And this story is not a fable. What this story helps us to know is that God wants Israel to have a righteous king. God wants Israel to have a righteous king, both now and later, so that when the later readers of this book, this story, read this, they understand, oh, this is the kind of king God wants us to have. What we learn from this story is that Saul is not the kind of king that God wants Israel to have. But David is the kind of king God wants Israel to have. So you could argue that really that's the main thing we're supposed to take away. That's the main thing we're supposed to learn from this story, is that God wants Israel to have a righteous king. Saul is not that kind of king, but David is that kind of king, or is going to be that kind of king. Now, so I say all of that to say we need to be careful that we don't fableize or turn the biblical stories into fables. Having said that, there are things that I think we can take away from this story. There are things that we can apply to our own lives as Christians that are important, as long as we understand that these are not the primary point of the story. First one being that because God wants Israel to have a righteous king, we need to understand that Jesus has become, or Jesus is, our righteous king. Okay? So David, more than once in his life, the character David foreshadows the Messiah that is to come. He foreshadows Jesus who is to come in the New Testament. So when we read this story, one of the takeaways we need to walk away with is that Jesus, for us as New Testament Christians, Jesus is our righteous king. Okay? An important lesson, even though that's not really the intended purpose of this story, it is something that we can take away from the story. Another takeaway that we can identify is that the greater battle always is a spiritual battle, not a political or military battle. Now, if you look at this story, if you go all the way back to this chapter, verse 1, you're going to see that when Saul heard that David was in a certain location, Saul gathered up 3,000 troops to go after David. Now, in the prior chapter, we learn that David had 600 soldiers with him. David's army amounted to 600 men. Saul is now pursuing David with 3,000 soldiers. And yet, from this story, what we discover is that David has the opportunity to kill Saul, not in battle, not in a military engagement between the 3,000 and the 600. That wasn't the point. The point is that David had the opportunity to kill Saul without battle, but he didn't do it. And yet, David in this story is the clear winner. He is the clear victor, even though there was no military or political battle that takes place. David won the battle at a spiritual level. He won the battle at a heart level. And that's an important lesson for us to learn, because oftentimes today in our culture, we begin to think that, oh, it's all about military might. It's all about political power. And we think things have to happen. If we can just get the right president, everything is going to be okay. But the real battle is always a spiritual battle, not a military battle, not a political battle. So that's an important takeaway that we can walk away from this text with. And finally, another takeaway that we can glean from this story is that mercy is in fact a godly quality or godly characteristic. Now, that's not the point of the story. The story is not about the fact that we should have mercy, but it is a truth we can take away from this story. In fact, the reason Saul says David has been more righteous than me is because David showed him mercy. It was David's mercy towards Saul that prompted Saul's response or statement that David is more righteous than I am. So we need to keep in mind that even though this story is not encouraging us necessarily, the point of the story is not to say, be merciful. That's not the point. It is in fact true, and it is an important takeaway for us to say that and recognize that in reality, mercy is a godly quality. It is a righteous characteristic, and it's something we should demonstrate. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.